We talk often of the midterm elections as though they will, have some final say, or 2028, and how, the United States might go back to normal. Unfortunately, yes, that's unlikely. Trump is not an aberration. He is riding a wave of American history, and in particular conservative organising in the United States. And what he did was give that conservative movement that sits behind him a generational victory. He gave them the executive office, the presidency, he gave them Congress, and he's given them the Supreme Court. That movement is not going to let go of that, not without a big fight. And they told us this. They told us what they would do before the last election. They wrote it down in something called Project 2025 in, 900 pages of quite intricate detail. They explained what they would do. And it was very clear from that, from Donald Trump's own words, from his first administration, from what happened in between, that Trump was never an isolationist. He never planned to withdraw the United States from its role in the world. He just planned to radically reshape that role. And he was never anti-war. Again, if you just listened to Donald Trump speak, it was very clear that he wasn't anti-war, he was just anti-losing wars. And he was convinced, and he's still convinced, that he can win them. And it's for that reason that we have the situation that we have today in Iran. Again, you just had to listen to Donald Trump speak, you had to listen to the people around him speak, who have wanted to go after Iran for decades, since the Islamic Revolution. And in that sense, Donald Trump is in some ways, I think, a prisoner of American history and a prisoner of the movement that brought him to power. And I think in that context, it's really important to understand that Iran is not a distraction. That's not what that is. It is part of this radical project to reshape not just the United States domestically, but the United States' role in the world. And part of that project is not just to destroy international law, although that is part of it, and unfortunately they're being very successful in that project, but it's also to destroy the foundational principle that sits under our system of international law, which is a moral principle that killing is inherently bad and should be avoided. That's not a moral principle that drives this administration. Again, you just have to listen to them speak. You have to listen to the glee with which Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth talks about the United States enemy in Iran. You just have to listen to any of Trump's surrogates. You have to listen to the way that Trump talks about violence, the way he relishes talking about bombs and violence and blood running down the aisles. This is the ideology that drives that administration, which raises some pretty significant questions for Australia, questions that this government seems unwilling to face. And that is also a product of history and a product of the history of Australia's relationship with the United States. Australia has followed the United States into almost every war it has fought since the end of the Second World War, no matter where, no matter when, and no matter why. And so in that sense, the Australian government's position on Iran is historically consistent. What the AUKUS submarine deal does is make that position our default position. It makes it inevitable that we follow the United States into every war it fights, no matter where, no matter when, and no matter why. And AUKUS is based, and the alliance more broadly is based, on the idea that we must do that because that ensures the United States will protect us. It gives us a security guarantee from the United States. Now, that was always a myth. What Donald Trump does is just say the quiet part out loud, that the United States is not there to protect us. The America we thought we knew is gone, and it is not coming back. And the current government has either failed to see this coming or has refused to. And I'm not actually sure which one is worse. And this is despite the fact, I think what's truly extraordinary about this is that this is despite the fact that the last election was, I think, at least in part, a repudiation of Trumpism. It was a rejection of Trumpism or a kind of Trumpian politics in Australia. I think most Australians don't want to live in Donald Trump's world. They don't want to live in a might is right world without rules where violence decides the fate of peoples. And poll after poll is indicating this, is indicating that Australians are losing faith in the United States. A poll we did at the Australia Institute suggests that more Australians think a more independent foreign policy is in our interest than think we should have a closer alliance with the United States. And if you know much about how Australians have historically thought about the United States, that's a pretty radical shift in how Australians view our alliance. And we're not even travelling to the United States. The number of Australians travelling to the United States has fallen off a cliff because we can see what is happening there. And I think that most Australians reject that kind of politics. And the government doubling down on the alliance, in spite of this, making us so close to Trump, undermines that relationship. It undermines democracy in the United States and it undermines democracy in Australia. But I think that's where we have an opportunity to rethink our place in the world. Donald Trump offers that opportunity to us to rebuild systems of international law and to review AUKUS, to review the submarine deal, to say that actually circumstances have changed since we agreed to this deal and it's time for a review. And that's why we have a petition at the Australia Institute calling for a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS, which already has over 40,000 signatures, and we're hoping to keep pushing that up. So please, if you haven't already, there are postcards on your seat that can link you to that petition and to share it. What we need is a government that is brave enough to do that, to say that circumstances have changed and we're going to rethink our role in the world, because actually Australia can play a really positive role in rebuilding not just our own role in the world, but international law more broadly, systems that keep all of us safer. So with that, I'm going to pass over, I think, to Jamie next for some more context about Australia's role in the world and our relationship with China. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you very much.
Actually, sorry, Jamie, I have to introduce you.
Thanks again. Well, let's start by thinking a little bit. What does $368 billion actually buy us in terms of AUKUS? Let's start with some details. Starting next year, under AUKUS, our compatriots over in WA get the right to host a few visiting US and UK nuclear submarines. Then, in about 7 to 10 years, Australia may have the opportunity to buy between 3 to 5 used US submarines, if the US manages to build them and if they agree to part with them. Then in about 20 years, we may actually start building 3 to 5 of these nuclear-powered submarines ourselves in South Australia. Now, in exchange for these future opportunities, you and I, have already sent the American military $2.8 billion, another $1.5 billion soon to go out the door in a non-refundable down payment for AUKUS. Overall, we are being very generous, providing some $9.4 billion to the US and to the UK shipbuilding industries. It'll help build up their infrastructure, their outsourcing capacity, their workforce and their technological development and their government oversight. So, is AUKUS a good deal for Australia? Will it actually deliver what it says on paper? I think we can all think a little bit about this here tonight. There are, in fact, growing concerns about AUKUS among many experts. First, Australia is very unlikely to actually ever receive any submarines. To sell us those 3 or so used subs in a decade, the US will first have to find a way very quickly to double their current production. As in a recent US Navy report points out, it's simply not happening. Also, before they can sell us any subs, the US Navy chief has to first certify that any vessel they sell to us is not essential for America's own defense. And what that means is at any point in the next decade, America can simply refuse to sell us the subs that our government has already spent billions of our tax dollars on. And indeed, many experts think that this is the most likely outcome. And the UK element of AUKUS is even worse shape, and we're paying them too, another $4.6 billion. Now, even if by some miracle we finally do get those subs on budget and on time, they won't start arriving for another decade, with the final boat not set to launch until 40 years from now. And it's quite possible during that time that the advances in undersea drone technology means that they'll be rendering the subs essentially very vulnerable to this relatively cheap countermeasures. So aside from that $368 billion, what are some of the other costs of AUKUS? Well, for one, we're selling off our sovereignty, our right to make decisions here in Australia about how our tax dollars and our military are being used. As ANU scholar Hugh White says, AUKUS is basically an attempt by America to get Australia to pay to bolster U.S. military power against China. And we know from past experience what it means to be a junior partner in America's wars. In a conflict with China, the U.S. will not be listening to Australia on how those subs are being used. We know that 2 years ago, our government provided secret political commitments to the U.S., commitments which the government still refuses to make public. Already, as part of the AUKUS ramp-up, Australian sub sailors are being based on U.S. subs. Indeed, as we found out last week, several were on the U.S. sub that sunk an Iranian ship sailing in international waters. And our political leaders had no say in this decision. They weren't even asked. In exchange for this loss of sovereignty, we're supposed to be buying security to make our country and all of us safer. But, and here's the real ripoff, AUKUS will make us less safe, not more so. We are outsourcing our foreign policy to Washington at a particularly dangerous time. The U.S. is pursuing a military-first, highly aggressive policy towards China. China is and will continue to respond in kind. The great two powers are falling into a dangerous spiral, what we call a security dilemma, where each side spends more and more on their military, cooperates and trusts each other less and less, and both end up less secure. Australians are being dragged along on this dangerous path, and it's not in our interests. Now, I want our government to retain the right to decide what our Navy does overseas. AUKUS takes that decision out of our hands and gives it over to the American military and to Donald Trump. And I don't know about you, but I didn't vote for Trump. And by agreeing to AUKUS, we are also at risk of losing our freedom to make our own decisions over who we cooperate with on academic research and on technological development. Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which covers a broad array of military-related technology cooperation, is already leading to more U.S. pressure on the Australian government to limit our cooperation with our partners overseas on research and technology. Some of the other hidden costs of AUKUS include the risk of a nuclear accident involving weapons-grade uranium and the damage the deal does to global cooperation on nuclear non-proliferation. And then there are the reputational and the diplomatic costs to our relationship with France and to our neighbors in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, whom the government has refused to consult with and who have repeatedly denounced this deal. Now, even harder to quantify are the economic costs that AUKUS may pose to our highly profitable trading relationship with China. Now remember, unlike America, we run a large trade surplus with China. We sell over $200 billion a year of goods and services to China. And those profits help fund our schools, hospitals, roads. Ironically, they provide some of the money we're now sending to America for AUKUS. And finally, there's the cost to our own defense budget and strategy. With AUKUS, we are locking ourselves in to a defense strategy for decades, centered on these large crewed vessels, which are expensive to build and maintain, and are increasingly vulnerable as drone and other technology rapidly advances. And meanwhile, we're facing growing American pressure to expand our own defense spending. Now, even ignoring the likely cost overruns and delays, AUKUS will cost Australia somewhere around $11 billion a year, soaking up 1/5 of our current annual defense budget. 1 out of every 5 defense dollars going for those 6 American submarines for decades to come. It's no wonder the former Deputy Defense Secretary, Peter Jennings, warns the government is destroying the current Australian Defense Force for these future submarines. So to conclude, I would agree with our former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, who calls AUKUS one of the worst foreign policy and defense decisions our country has ever made, putting not only at risk, profound risk, our sovereign independence, but generating more risk than reward for the very national security it promises to protect. So what can we do now as individuals? Well, as citizens, we should demand that the Labour government hold this parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS, seeking public submissions, consult with experts, and allow our elected representatives to fully and fairly debate the merits of AUKUS. And just think, what could we adults do with that $368 billion right here in Australia? We could wipe out the entire national student debt 5 times over. Or we could replicate the last tax cut package 21 times. The government's recent bulk billing investment over 46 times. We could build 200 new state-of-the-art hospitals or 600,000 new social housing units. We could pay for NDIS for 8 years, replicate all federal education spending or fully fund aged care for a decade. We could fund our foreign aid budget entirely for the next 72 years, or we could replicate our current foreign aid to the Pacific for 172 years. Or, and perhaps simply of all, we could simply tell the Americans we're leaving AUKUS. And we could send each and every Australian household a check for $40,000. Now, I don't know about you, but me, I want my money back. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jamie. There's so much to unpack there, and I can see the questions are already coming through, so thank you. But I am a terrible host, and I didn't introduce Jamie, so like the Labor Party trying to retrofit a sensible policy onto AUKUS, I'm just going to do that quickly before I hand to David. Jamie is an associate professor at Sydney University in Northeast Asian politics in the Department of Government and International Relations. His research and teaching in the areas of Chinese foreign policy, East Asian politics and international relations. And his most recent book, published by Oxford University Press, is Orchestration, China's Economic Statecraft Across Asia and Europe. So we will come back, I hope, to Australia's relationship with China and the role AUKUS plays in that. But in the meantime, it's my pleasure to introduce somebody many of you, I'm sure, will know, David Shoebridge, who is the Australian Greens Senator for New South Wales. David is a former barrister and a long-time environmental and social justice advocate. He was first elected to the Senate in 2022 after serving on the New South Wales Legislative Council for over a decade. David holds the portfolios of Foreign Affairs, Peace and Nuclear Disarmament, Defence and Veterans Affairs, Home Affairs, Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs, Justice and Digital Rights. So he has a really easy time with it. Over to you, David.
Yeah, thanks very much, Emma and Jamie, both for coming here. And I want to start by acknowledging this is First Nations land and pay our collective respects. And in this struggle against AUKUS, particularly against the poisoning effect of a nuclear industry on this country, I've got to tell you, some of our strongest allies and some of the clearest campaigners are First Nations people across this country who've been fighting to protect their land and their water from this poisonous industry for decades. And if for no other reason, we should fight AUKUS to be colleagues and friends and comrades of First Nations peoples to protect this land. But this land is always was. Now, I kind of knew this would be a bad idea because Emma and Jamie, between them, are like two of these incredibly intelligent and articulate advocates in the spot. And coming as the politician and sitting between two people who are full-time brains on this is always quite awkward. But actually, Jamie and I and the Ku-ring-gai and Hornsby Green sort of cooked this up just at the end of last year. And at the end of last year, we had a local meetings in the back of Turramurra, I think, and we said it'd be good to bring people together to talk about AUKUS because we're having these conversations in our bedroom, in our lounge rooms, in our workplaces, on the way to work, and we thought there was a real appetite for it. And then we hatched a plan to drag Emma up from Canberra to come and speak to us as well. And this happened to be a good time for all of our diaries. And it couldn't be more timely, could it, to come together and talk about it. So thanks to the two local groups for putting the effort in, doing all the work to get us here, and thank you all for coming. I think it's a critical time to be talking about AUKUS. As that that video was playing at the beginning, it's out of date only because the numbers are wrong. Instead of spending $30 billion a year on defence, we're now spending $55 billion, and the plan is to get up to 75, close to $100 billion a year on defence. And the forward estimates now over the next 10 years, they're projected to spend not $400 billion, but $750 billion and counting on this defence project, of our money, our collective money, on defence. But as I was watching it, I was remembering this exchange that happened only about 6 weeks ago in Canberra. A slightly different room. It was a Senate Estimates room, which is where we have the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, the different senators from that on one side, and then about 150 people from Defence on the other side. A lot of gold braid, a lot of taking themselves very seriously, all of that. And they basically all hate me. That's the dynamic in that room. In that room, there was Michaelia Cash, who I can see some of you know her, a coalition senator who is radically right-wing, fairly aggressively right-wing, intemperate in many of her thoughts about the world. But she was having this exchange with this guy called Hugh Jeffreys. And Hugh Jeffreys is the senior policy analyst from Defence. And he's the one who defends defence exports to Israel and does the thinking about, for the forces of darkness, for the evil empire, about how defence fits in with the rest of the world. I've had many exchanges with Hugh Jeffreys, and I think he's a significant part of the problem in the broader thinking, because it's an unquestioning alliance with Washington, hiding things from the public. But this particular exchange was kind of interesting, because they're having this exchange between the two of them and saying, well, look, there's a player in the world, and it's incredibly destabilising in our region and in the broader world, and they are flouting international law and repeatedly flouting international law and making our region a less safe place. And I'm okay, and this player as well, it is repeatedly using tariff policy and trade and tariff policy to try and coerce outcomes from other countries around the world. And that's destabilising for the world. It's a very bad outcome. And the player also is ignoring international sovereignty and the basic concept of having of opposition to aggressive wars for territorial advantage. It's breaching this concept of sovereignty, which has been the underpinning of the post-World War II international security. And they had this exchange, goes for about 5 minutes, and then I say, well, what country? It was like literally that exchange. Guess what country? China. And I it is, to give you a sense of what it's like down there, it's this alternate world, and it's like, as Emma said, that it's as though the world is changing around them, but their careers, their political history, their post-political career working for an arms manufacturer, their and that's serious, their post-defence industry working for an arms manufacturer, their internal careers inside the defence establishment, inside the ADF, inside the parliament, are all so tied to Washington that they cannot see, and they refuse to see. They don't have the political imagination, or even just the ability to take the blinders off and realise what is happening in the world. And that is what is driving us down this endless pathway of siding on to Trump. And that is why, a fortnight ago, literally it's only a fortnight, it feels like longer, but a fortnight ago, when Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu commenced their illegal war on Iran after trying to manufacture consent for a number of months about demonising the regime and working with the diaspora. Do you remember all the stuff about the son of the Shah who was going to ride in on a charger and have regime change and democracy and goodness? Remember that? All of that manufacturing of consent for this war. That's why. That inability to imagine a different world, the careers that are tied to Washington, the machinery that is tied to Washington, multi-billion-dollar contracts tied to Washington, they can't imagine a world different for that. And that is, I think, one of the critical reasons why, to his utter shame, Anthony Albanese was the first leader in the world to come out and support and publicly support Trump and Netanyahu's illegal attack on Iran. It's extraordinary. It is absolutely extraordinary. But I suppose we'll come on to the events of the last fortnight, and I think we'll wrap much of the discussion around that, and I'm sure many of the questions will be about that. But let's just unpick a little bit of what AUKUS is at the moment. And Jamie and Emma have done a fair chunk of that, so I'll be super quick. We are spending billions of dollars giving it to the US for their shipbuilding, and that is, as Jamie said, meant to increase the rate of production of US nuclear submarines, so they have a few spare ones in the early 2030s to give to us. That is not working. They have to be producing more than double the number of submarines that they're making to come close to having any spare to us. They have not moved the dial. We've been pumping money in for about 4 years. The US has been pumping money in for 4 years. They haven't moved the dial. And every year that they don't double production, it gets further and further and further away from achieving that goal. It is unachievable now. There will not be any spare nuclear submarines, but we still keep pumping the money in. And guess how much money we get back of the billions we pour in if we don't get any submarines? Any guesses? Yeah. Correct, $0. We get $0 back. We are pumping billions of dollars into the UK, mainly going to one corporation in the United Kingdom. Does anybody know that corporation in the United Kingdom? Not Lockheed Martin. Lots of the money goes. Did I hear Rolls-Royce? Yes, we're giving billions and billions of dollars to Rolls-Royce for their nuclear reactor program, which the UK Auditor General, their sort of chief auditor, independent auditor, says is in such a meltdown, no pun intended, it will not produce nuclear reactors. It cannot produce nuclear reactors for the AUKUS machine, but we still keep pumping money into it. It is extraordinary. But we are doing something that will achieve an outcome. We are spending $8.5 billion of our own money, Australian taxpayers' money, to build a nuclear submarine base just outside of Perth. That will be up and running by 2027. On no trajectory are we going to have nuclear submarines by 2027, by the way. But it's going to be up and running by 2027 in order for the US and the UK. They largely the submarines won't come from the UK because they've only got one that they can keep in the water at the moment. All the others are in maintenance and there's no likelihood of them ever actually harming any adversary. But they will be US nuclear submarines, and the plan is from 2027 we will have built the United States with our own money, $8 billion of our own money, a new nuclear submarine attack base just outside of Perth for them to bring their nuclear submarines from the west coast of the United States to the west coast of WA, because it's more convenient for the US to have them there, so they don't have to travel all the way across the Pacific Ocean to go and make war on China. They get a shortcut coming from Australia up to the Malacca Straits. And that is being built, and that will be operational by 2027. It is extraordinary. So you might be asking yourself, well, you know, Donald Trump has been reviewing all of these alliances all around the world, junking NATO, getting rid of all of the traditional alliances with Western Europe, threatening to invade Canada. Why has Donald Trump, who has an America first, only cut a deal that's good for America? Why has about the only agreement that he's looked at and said, yep, that's a beauty, is AUKUS, right? Yeah. It's about the only agreement that he's agreed to because it is so radically one-sided towards the United States. I reckon he reads AUKUS and he says, bloody hell, because remember, it was signed by Biden, and he normally hates anything signed by Biden, and he normally tear it up. But he just can't bring himself to tear this one up because he reads it and he says, now hang on, they give us how many billion? Well, about 4 or 5 billion US, sir. And what do we have to give them? Don't have to give them anything, sir, we just get the money. And they're building us a nuclear submarine base off Perth. How much are we paying for that? We're not paying anything for that, sir, they're building it for ourselves. And in 2033, how many submarines do we have to give them? Don't have to give them any submarines, sir. They're going to. It's a no refund deal. He said, of course he's keeping the deal. Of course he is keeping the deal. Because they look at the deal and cannot believe we are such incredible mugs. And it is extraordinary, really, isn't it? It's just bloody extraordinary. So, but it is playing out right now. Right now, as Emma said, we are seeing the reality of AUKUS. Labor, the Coalition, One Nation, they all love this stuff, right? And down there in Canberra, we now call them the war parties, because there's almost nothing that separates them. Labor, the Coalition and One Nation. They love Donald Trump, they're committed to the US alliance, and they all support this war. They all support this war. The only difference between them is that the Coalition brought a motion saying they wanted to congratulate the US for the war, and Labor wouldn't have that. No. They amended it to say that they support the war. So that is the big debate between Labor and the Coalition, whether they congratulate the US for the war or whether they just support it and do everything to support it. But the truth is, because we are so enmeshed with the United States through AUKUS, because our entire military is designed only to work when it's deployed with the US military, as part of a US military deployment, and because Labor, the Coalition and One Nation place AUKUS as some kind of fetish in our defence and foreign affairs policy, and they are so desperately afraid that the United States may walk away from it, there really wasn't a decision made by Australia to join this war or to support this war. It was the inevitable outcome of a decision that was made 4 years ago to double down on AUKUS and to sign a part of AUKUS. And so we could try and pretend that, early on Sunday morning, there was an emergency meeting of the Australian Cabinet and they all got together and they had a look at this last illegal war from the United States and they asked themselves, and they seriously sat down and they debated whether or not they'd support it. But I don't think that's what happened. I think they had a meeting, and I think they had a defence briefing, and I think they had, therefore, as a result, we support this war. And there wasn't even a rational thought about it. Ignoring the incredible danger it's driving the world into. Ignoring the fact that we will inevitably be sending troops and support there, and that's already happening. Ignoring how dangerous it is to keep feeding a bully. When the bully demands your lunch money, you just keep giving them money, they just become a nastier and more aggressive bully, and that's what's happening out the world. And ignoring the calls that we've seen from, say, Prime Minister Carney from Canada, from other nations around the world who are saying, we need to come together, middle powers need to come together to resist this and think of a different way. None of that was the discussion they had. They said, the United States is at war, we will support that war, it's the outcome of AUKUS, the question is how high will Donald Trump make us jump? That was the discussion around the Canberra room. And I don't know about you, but that sends a cold shiver down my spine, thinking about what the next war or the next dangerous thing we're going to be giving a green light to. So thanks for coming. There's a lot to talk about tonight.
There is a lot to talk about, and I can see that there are already over 50 questions to get through, so I will go as quickly as I can. But first, I thought I'd just follow up with you, David, because it's been a particularly appalling couple of weeks, and just ask you about this last week in particular, going from the point of asking the Foreign Minister in Parliament whether there were Australians on that submarine and being told that we don't disclose that information, to having it confirmed by the Prime Minister that there were, in fact, Australians on the submarine. What has this week been like for you?
Yeah, it's been not utopia, but dystopia down there. Just that exchange. Like, our office follows closely all the deployments that Australia has. At the end of last year, there was a whole lot of glossy materials being produced. I don't know if you remember seeing them. Lots of glossy ads and newspaper articles about Australians being embedded inside US nuclear submarines. A US nuclear submarine came to Perth in February of last year. Glossies, Australian sailors were being put on it and sent out. Another one came at the end of last year. And there were articles written by the sort of war journalists in the Sydney Morning Herald. I remember one particularly from Matthew Knott, who's never seen a scare with China he hasn't wanted to join, or a war with the US he hasn't wanted to join. But Matthew Knott for the Sydney Morning Herald wrote this piece that sticks in my mind about how Australian sailors were on this nuclear submarine cutting through the Azure Ocean and the Indian Ocean, and the sun sparkled off the water as the submarine headed out of Fremantle, and talking about it in this, utter spin. But what they also said was, the plan is for, in the next 3 to 4 years, to ramp up the number of Australians on US nuclear submarines so that more than 10% of the crew of the entire US nuclear submarine fleet will be Australian. That's their plan, and they're working towards that plan. So when we saw reports of a nuclear submarine sinking an Iranian frigate in international waters, thousands of kilometres from the war zone, having come from a friendship flotilla which involved the United States. Not only did the US nuclear submarine sink it, they sank it with a torpedo co-designed by Australia. And then they left the Iranian sailor survivors to drown at sea in breach of the Geneva Convention. And it was 11 hours before a Sri Lankan vessel came to recover the survivors who hadn't drowned and died at sea at the time. We immediately thought to ourselves, well, almost certainly there will be Australian personnel on that nuclear submarine. So we trot into the Senate and we do my job as a senator and asked Senator Wong, the Foreign Minister, can you confirm or deny whether there are Australian sailors on there? Can you confirm or deny whether or not you agreed it was a war crime to leave the Iranian sailors to drown? Can you tell us anything? And what we got was, can't confirm or deny, we don't want to, disclose. Somehow it would be a danger to national security to find out whether or not Australians were on board that nuclear submarine. She refused to say anything. And it was this sort of surreal exchange. But then the pressure built, we worked with other journalists, the questions kept coming, and then eventually the Prime Minister came out the next day and in an exclusive sit-down interview with Sky News, not even in a press conference, in an exclusive sit-down interview with Sky News where he got soft-pedaled questions by Sky, he said, yes, there were 3 Australian sailors on board that thing. But then, the spin they've been trying to do since then, they call it the bedroom defence in Canberra. They now say, and they've been backgrounding journalists, that when the button was pressed to sink the Iranian frigate, all the Australian sailors were sent to bed. All sent to bed. I'm not actually making that up. They were sent to bed. And once the frigate had been sunk, they were told to get out of bed again. Now, maybe you can do that with 3 sailors on board, but you sure as hell can't do it with 10% of the crew. And as we've been asking Defence, I said, what's your plans for a hot war that we don't agree with the United States? Let's say there's a war we don't agree with, and 10% of the entire crew across the entire US nuclear submarine fleet are made of Australians. What, are they all going to go to bed in the next conflict? I mean, it only has to be spoken about to realise, well, what you were saying is true. This AUKUS thing, without a decision, without any pretense of autonomy, these wars, these American wars, are our wars because of AUKUS. And that played out. But it was pretty surreal, I've got to tell you.
Spark. Jamie, how do you think all of this is viewed by China?
A couple of things. I think from China's perspective, first of all, obviously, AUKUS aligns us closer with the US and puts us directly in the crossfires. We're putting ourselves in harm's way with every time we're basing American submarines here, we're basing B-52 bombers up north. Every time we're closer with the Americans, we're drawing ourselves deeper into conflict with China. The Chinese have to decide at some point if we are their trading partner, if we are their friends, or we're not. And it's clear that these are decisions that we're really outsourcing to Washington in a way that we're not able to make choices here. Now, we went through a rather tough patch with China a few years ago. And it's not to be pretended that the relationship with China is not a simple one, and China is not an easy to manage country. But it is for us an essential relationship. It's an important country, and it's one that we need to manage here in Australia. Now, I think in many ways we have righted some of the ship with the relationship with China. Finally, we've backed off some of the worst of the relationship. But I think to take the China relationship and our relationship very seriously requires a clear-eyed view of what our interests are with China. And they are clearly not the same as Americans. And I think the danger here is that these choices are really not being made here. So China would be very concerned about where Australia sits in all of this. The Chinese, of course, as I think the video very helpfully described, do not have an interest in blocking the flow of ships coming in or out of China. The flow of goods and products and services going out of China and then resources coming into China are a lifeblood for China. And just to say a word or two about what China's facing with regards to the US and Israeli war in Iran and in the Middle East. The Chinese are one of the major investors in the region. The Chinese have built important infrastructure in the region, whether it's resource-intensive, desalination plants, whether it's commercial infrastructure or otherwise. The Chinese are bolstering exports to the region, putting in capital and putting in Chinese technology that they hope will be an important part of their relationships throughout the Middle East. This war is certainly damaging that. They're blowing up Chinese facilities, Chinese investment facilities as well in Iran. So the Chinese are very concerned with the war. They've come out very strongly to be critical. They've reached out to partners around the region to try to sort of build those diplomatic ties again. So I think the Chinese, for one, are certainly looking for an end to the US and Israeli bombing campaigns in the war, and looking for a restoration of normal economic ties. And for our own relationship with China, we really need to take a clear look at where our interests lie in this, and to make our own decisions. And it's what David was talking about. The giving up of that choice and that autonomy to Washington, I think more than anything else, really should worry those of us here in the world.
Deeply. I'm going to go to questions from the audience now because we're up to 62. So quick answers, everybody. So the first question here is from Shad, which asks, and I might put this to you first, David, because I know you have thoughts about this. Do you think that AUKUS, which, you know, as we've discussed or alluded to, I think, is clearly aimed at China, even if we're not willing to say that out loud, do you feel that AUKUS makes us a target?
Well, I wouldn't say it's aimed at China, it's aimed at a power in the Indo-Pacific region. It is clearly aimed at China. And in fact, the whole concept of nuclear submarines, why does Australia need nuclear submarines? We don't need nuclear submarines to protect the approaches to Australia. We don't need nuclear submarines to protect some of the choke points in the Indonesian archipelago coming to Australia. We don't need nuclear submarines to protect our ports. That could all be done perfectly well if you want submarines with conventional and with conventionally powered submarines super well. And if we bought them from Sweden or South Korea or Japan, probably not North Korea, we would already have those submarines if that's what you wanted to do. I as a Greens senator, I don't think that's a particularly useful spend for our money, but if it was about protecting Australia, we'd already have conventional submarines. They'd already be in the water, they'd be replacing the aging Collins fleet, and they would be protecting those bits and defending Australia. And China can see that the only reason we're buying nuclear submarines is not to protect Australia. They make no sense to protect Australia. They are only designed to project force into the South China Sea, directly off the Chinese coast, as part of a broader US commitment to contain China, to follow any Chinese nuclear subs as they leave their ports, to trace them and follow them and sink them with other US submarines at the beginning of a hot war. China can see that. I mean, anybody who's looking at it can see it, and they realise that the nuclear submarines are not to defend Australia, but they're actually to be part of a US contingent to attack and contain China. So what does that mean? Well, that means far from them making us safer, the Chinese can see that a nuclear submarine base in Australia, and whether it's notionally Australian flag subs or it's US flag subs, they are being positioned in Australia to be a direct threat to China. And you know, defence hawks in Washington will actually point out that if there's a hot war between China and the US, and it becomes a limited nuclear exchange, if you can have such a thing, and I don't think you can, but if you can have a limited nuclear exchange, some of the priority targets in that exchange would be Pine Gap, Northwest Cape, RWF Tyndall, and a nuclear submarine base off Perth. They would be, you know, high priority targets, and one of the benefits of targets in Australia, if you're China, is you take out some targets in Australia, and then a US president, Donald Trump, who make, you know, America first, has to say, well, would you trade Los Angeles for Alice Springs? Would you risk San Diego for Perth? And you kind of only have to say it to realise the answer is no, and to realise why those kinds of bases, that positioning, us joining part of an attack against China, I don't think China has any interests in territorial contest or attacking Australia because of Australia. Absolutely not. No territorial interest, no ability to really project conventional military force here. The only threat we get from China is by being part of a US military contingent. It makes us desperately less safe.
Sure. Okay. I'll keep going. The questions are moving. David, then you mentioned Pine Gap there in that answer, and the next question is from Lewis, who asks, shouldn't we advocate for the closure of Pine Gap more than, I guess, the end of AUKUS, and if not, why not?
Well, they're two of the same thing, I think. Pine Gap is notionally a joint facility just outside of, outside of Alice Springs in Central Australia. It is a critical part of US global warfighting. It's where they crunch a bunch of information to help target their attacks. It's almost certainly being used right now to help target the attacks in Iran. It's been used by Israel to help target attacks in Gaza. And it's a critical part of US global warfighting. The Defence Minister comes up with this, I don't know if you've heard how he talks about it. It's the most bizarre, tangled language you could ever hear. He's been asked about Pine Gap and this war, and he says, well, no Australian personnel in Pine Gap are directly involved in the direct application of force in the current conflict. And kind of what that means is, yes, of course, all the Americans are using Pine Gap for the direct application of force in the conflict. Australians are keeping the place running and making sure it's already there for the US to use, but it's actually, and they want you to believe it's not critical to warfighting. So yes, we should join with First Nations people on that land who have been fighting Pine Gap for bloody ever to say, get that obscenity off their land, off the land of, off their land, and we should make it part of ending AUKUS. But I think they are absolutely tied together, and we would get huge anger and pushback from the United States if we did that. And there's been history of that, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's why I would argue that the Labor government lost a huge opportunity actually with the Biden administration to negotiate with a friendly administration to change the terms of that agreement, which doesn't mean that opportunity won't come again, but, for now it's gone. And I think, of course, Pine Gap is a huge part of that. And often, we find out more about what's happening there, we find out more about what's happening with AUKUS from our American colleagues than we do from our own government, who will hide behind that kind of strategic language. I've never heard anybody say the word strategic more than Richard Miles. I have another, there's lots of questions. Jamie, perhaps one for you, given your work with community on this issue. It's a question from Will, who asks, how do we get broader community engagement on this issue, on the issue of AUKUS?
Well, as David said, when we were thinking about what kind of event we could organize here, I'm a member of the Hornsby Greens and our local Ku-ring-gai Greens, we're thinking, what can we do that would get folks out and about? And AUKUS, surprisingly enough, I think has been a real success for us. I think it's a testament to everybody's concerns that you're all here tonight, and a testament to all the hard work of the volunteers who made this possible. So I'd like to first give a hand to everybody for making that huge effort today. Precisely what we've been lacking on some of these issues is exactly this kind of conversation. The saying that foreign policy stops at the water's edge. Well, it traveled well over the Parramatta River north up here to the north shore of Sydney. And I think it shows that people around the city and around the country are really interested in engaging on some of these issues. So I think this kind of involvement of coming out today and then using the networks, using your friends and relationships, the organizations or institutions that you're a part of, to go back and spread the word, to build this kind of engagement and cooperation. It's the very much danger that we have. AUKUS is a great example of groupthink, of small numbers of people sitting in very small rooms with no windows and very little scrutiny. We get cigars and poison and very poor decision making out of these kind of things. And what we need is to shine the light on these kind of conversations. What we need is a broader sense of public participation. And there are a lot of people, I think, academics and folks in think tanks and otherwise who are more than happy to engage more with community and this kind of cooperation between universities, between politicians, between others who can come out and kind of work together to engage our fellow citizens, to have these kind of conversations, and particularly connect the issues to what matters to all of us. When I think about what I was going to say today, ultimately what really mattered to me was sort of, well, what are the other things that we can use this money for? Academics talk about the sort of guns versus butter debate, and we need a whole lot more butter in this country. We need a whole lot of more spending for things that we know we need every day. We're in the middle of a major cost of living crisis. Folks are doing it hard in all kinds of ways, and many of our public services are suffering. I'm in a public university, and I think education in this country, from universities down to elementary schools and daycares, need more support. There's a lot of sort of need out there, and a lot of folks are needing very much so. And I think the ways we can connect the spending for people, that we can show them that this issue matters because it is ultimately some kind of zero sum. The money that's wasted on American submarines and sent to the American military establishment is money that we lose here at home. And making that real to people is showing how it matters, and having those conversations in public, in the streets, in our religious institutions, in our public institutions, is really where this sort of change begins. And so I think having faith in that and engaging in that on an individual level, feeling empowered and feeling excited and positive about that is really where this begins. So.
One of the things that they rely upon, the war parties, but particularly Labor and the Liberal Party, they're the ones who are like in it up to their neck. One of the things they rely upon is they want you to think that there's something really secret about this. There's some secret special knowledge that only they have, and they can't tell you, and they can't tell me, and they can't tell anyone else. There's a secret special knowledge, and you should feel stupid. You shouldn't be asking questions. You should just mind your place because they hold this secret knowledge. And it's their secret knowledge that they have that makes them do really obviously dumb things, right? And it is a farce. It's like that little bit at the end of, The Wizard of Oz where you pull it back and there's some little bloke behind it. There's no secret knowledge here. Like, this is about geopolitical analysis. It's about where you want the country to be. It's about what our economic and social and political future should be. But they want to make it really secret and special and make you feel like an idiot if you challenge them. But they're actually being so threatened by it now that just last week they set up a new secret defence committee to exclude me and any other crossbenchers from being on that super secret defence committee because they don't like answering questions. So they are being totally threatened because their project is under threat because people like you in this room are asking questions like you've asked to bring you to this room. So more of that.
How many other policies can we think of that would unite former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull with former Prime Minister Paul Keating? That's how bad this policy is. David, in the hypothetical scenario that we do have more scrutiny and we come to a different position on AUKUS, what would be the process of actually getting out of this agreement? What role do the House of Reps and the Senate have to play? How does that work practically?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, you'll be pleased to know the House of Reps and Senate really didn't play any major role. There was a kind of pretend oversight through a treaties committee, and then it kind of just got rolled through the Parliament. But we can terminate the agreement on 12 months' notice. Okay? So that's what the treaty provides. There's a termination provision. Some people say that termination provision only applies to the US and the UK on one reading of it, which, I don't think is fair. I think it's a termination clause on 12 months' notice. We can get out of it in 12 months. We have to give them back anything they've given us. I'm okay with that. They can have a couple of, used American admirals, and we can hand them back to them. We get no money back. Like, it's a no money back deal. But the sooner we get out of it, the better. So we can get out of it. We get out of it on 12 months' notice. That'll give us time to send the hundreds of US personnel that we're building homes for just outside of Fremantle. It'll give them time to plan their affairs, get their pets home. But that's the process under AUKUS. Of course, the challenge isn't terminating an agreement, and Donald Trump has proven time and time again that, he's willing to breach an agreement. He just doesn't care what's in the writing. Don't be silly. Ultimately, we would need to get to a point where the government felt that they could exercise a sovereign, independent decision. And I think that's the challenge. It's not what's in the treaty. And literally, you talk with Labor MPs in the corridors, and they say things like, I say, well, it's a bit nuts, isn't it? And they say, oh yeah, but look what happened to Spain. Look what happened to Spain. Look at all the trouble they're in. Oh, and look what happened to the UK and Starmer. Yeah, it's really, no, we couldn't do that. That is the problem. It's not what's in the treaty.
Just on that, Jamie, do you think it's reasonable to fear the wrath of Donald Trump, is it? We know that he lashes out, particularly at the United States traditional allies, when he thinks they've been disloyal or they've done something he doesn't like. So how do you think a government might approach dealing with a bully like this?
Well, aside from what David said about being a really sweetheart deal for the United States, in fact, there are a number of voices in the US who do also, from their side, raise serious concerns. We all have the dubious honor of being the first country to actually buy and take over American and run nuclear submarines from the United States. And the reason they haven't shared them so far is actually some pretty good reasons. First of all, that's some dangerous stuff. Highly enriched uranium, weapons-grade uranium, is very dangerous and difficult to take care of. The risks of an accident are tremendous. Furthermore, the idea that if the U.S. would actually send us any of these submarines, they have the potential, unlikely, but the potential to lose some authority or control over that. So there are serious efforts within the United States, within parts of Congress, and even within the bowels of the Pentagon, raising some concerns of the deal from their side. They're more than willing to throw more money at the American military establishment and the defense industrial complex. But there's a real concern that at some point, what if the Aussies actually don't listen to everything we do? So there's a serious effort to just take the free base and never actually want to send us any submarines. So I think there actually would be not only obviously real opportunity on our side, but the fallout certainly in a post-Trump America might be less than we think. I think we should have the courage to start pushing in that direction. I don't think that the cost will be nearly as substantial as some of the fears here in Canberra. And I just want to say a word or two about what I think is underpinning some of the AUKUS. If we're up here and we're telling you that AUKUS is such a bad idea and all these things which make a lot of sense, then how do we ever get here in the first place? And I think in talking about community involvement, what's happened so far, sort of the backstory of some of the drivers for AUKUS actually has been what people call a securitizing coalition. Small groups of people who work in very scary think tanks, journalists, certain intelligence officers, people in and around government in particular, who have really been fanning the fears of China for years now in this country. A colleague of mine, David Brophy, wrote a really nice book a couple of years ago called The China Panic, and where he sort of details the way in which a very few number of people, including the ABC and others, have really fed these fears, irrational fears of China, in ways that have fostered racism in this country, have fostered distrust, have separated us from many of our neighbors and our understanding of the appreciation for the diversity of our communities. And I think sort of challenging those voices and pushing back on that, again, is the kind of effort that I think we all need to have and the courage that we need to show here.
If we did terminate AUKUS and Trump or son of Trump was the president, there's no doubt they would try and punish us. They would probably withhold support for software updates for F-35s. They wouldn't help us target Tomahawk missiles. They would probably not be patching some of their battle management software or the software that helps our very modest surface fleet target and deal with incoming threats. Like, there would be those practical, real things about our defence force, which is incredibly dependent on US weapons manufacturers, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon and others, General Electric. We are incredibly dependent on the US for pretty much all of our major military equipment. And they would create real difficulties for us maintaining that and maintaining all of that equipment. Well, I'd say two things about that. First of all, most of that equipment is not even designed to have an independent defence force for Australia. It's US equipment bought from the US, supported by the US, because it's designed to be used to fight wars alongside the US and directed by the US. So probably we don't need to be doing a lot of that if we get out of Dodge and we end it. And secondly, doesn't that point out just how already dependent we are on the United States and how dangerous the relationship is? And we better start getting our own independence sooner rather than later. AUKUS doesn't make us an ally of the United States. That is the wrong thinking. And we've had it demonstrated in the last fortnight. AUKUS, our relationship with the United States, our utter dependence on the United States, makes us a hostage of the United States. And we should realise that pretty soon and get out.
So one of the arguments, I think, in favour of AUKUS or in favour of the alliance more broadly is around this idea of great power competition. And many of the people that you mentioned there, David, in the media and politics and defence, will point to particularly China's territorial claims in the South China Sea that are, disputed and widely criticised. So the question we have here, and I'll put this to both of you, is whether there is a need for another global power to offset this.
China is always going to be a challenging topic for anybody to engage with. I spent most of my adult life living in and spending time studying, trying to understand, and then teach and write about China. And I'm not sure I'm any farther along all these years later. It's a large, complex place, and certainly not an easy country. It's not a country that many of us might choose to sort of be citizens of or to live underneath the domestic rules of China. But it is a country we can live with. It is a country that we can live nearby. It is a country we can have a very productive, stable, and peaceful relationship with. And I think that includes the challenges that China on its neighbors face. Now, there's obviously a dramatic growth in Chinese economic power, and commensurate with that, military power and projection of that military power overseas. The closer you are to China, the more challenging some of those questions become. We, fortunately enough, are a very long ways away from a lot of these disputes. And the disputed sovereignty over these rocks, many of which are often not above water in the far distant area of the South China Sea, quite frankly, should not be a direct concern of many people in this room. Yes, the Chinese and their neighbors in Southeast Asia continue to sort of disagree over those. But the United States Navy is sailing us and itself in harm's way on purpose. They are looking to get involved in these disputes, and they are not adding to any increase in the possibility of a peaceful settlement or progress towards this at all. And we are not helping by getting deeper involved in a lot of these disputes. And we are not threatened by whatever they decide over whose rocks they may or may not be in the South China Sea. So quite frankly, I don't want my tax dollars going to that particular dispute at all. More broadly, I think it is possible for us to maintain a stable relationship with China. I think we can have a helpful and positive relationship. And the way to do that is the kind of cooperation with truly like-minded countries, with countries that actually do think like those of us here in the room think, who actually are looking for a true rules-based order, who are looking for international institutions to be re-strengthened again, who are looking to start to refund things like the United Nations, who are looking for truly a nuclear-free Pacific, who are looking for the kinds of cooperation with multilateral institutions like ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which have managed to keep peaceful and productive relationships with very challenging countries, both within their membership and in their region. So I think there's a lot of countries we're going to look to as models for how to engage with and cooperatively sort of have a peaceful and stable relationship with China. So there is a lot of opportunity. It's very essential that we do this, but the answer is do not start in Washington. They begin by looking closer to home.
Well, yes to that, but our relationship with the United States is called a sub-imperial relationship. Clinton Fernandez, Emma may have a different, more sophisticated analysis of it, but I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. What is our relationship with the United States? And our relationship with the United States is based upon this dependency thing, that we must have a great and powerful friend in our region to protect us from the region. Like, that is the thinking, that this idea that we're somehow have an illegitimate claim, and maybe we do have an illegitimate claim on this continent. Maybe that is recognising that we stole it from First Nations people, and maybe we haven't formed peace with First Nations people, and maybe we should come up with a compact so we feel comfortable living on this continent. That would be a good piece of national security and personal security for me, I know, feeling that we had peace in our own continent and a legitimate place on this continent. But I think that sort of insecurity, and some of it is based on race, some of it is based on history, the idea we need a great and powerful friend here to protect us from our own neighbours. I think it is just so absolutely dangerous and toxic. Our long-term interests as a country are not based upon some, historical text from, it's not based on the Magna Carta. That's not our future. Those traditions and our connection with, common law history and basic personal liberties, great and terrific. Core part of our culture going forward. It can be a part and should be a core part going forward. But our future is determined by by where we are. We are in the southern part of Southeast Asia, by our geography. And it's really good because it's about the most geopolitically secure part on the entire planet, right? There's a huge archipelago between us, oceans between us, and any other major landmass. The only country more safe than us is New Zealand, and that's because they're on the other side of us, right? We are in an incredibly geopolitically secure place. We're not threatened by China. We're probably a bit threatened by the United States, and actually threatened by the United States. They're probably the only power to threaten us. And that is an amazing thing to lean into. But instead of leaning into that geopolitical security, we are desperately spending money to try and bring ourselves to conflicts around the rest of the world. And we're inviting the United States here so we can be part of a conflict between the United States and China. We're inviting ourselves to a gunfight, right? And that is crazy dangerous for us. But there is a really different approach. We could lean into our geography. We could see our neighbours as neighbours and friends. Instead of creating a defence force to get us involved in a war with China, maybe we could evolve a defence force that is purely defensive, about defending Australia, often called the echidna strategy. You know, echidnas are lovely, they're cute, they don't endanger anyone unless you're an ant, and they're lovely native creatures. But if you threaten them, they hunker down and they're spiky, and you can't attack them. If we said to our neighbours in the region, well actually, we're no longer going to be part of projecting US force in the region. We're no longer going to be part of threatening China. We're no longer going to be building long-range strike assets like nuclear submarines. We're going to have a defence force entirely defensive, which won't threaten them. And we say that to Indonesia, and we say that to Malaysia, and we say that to China. And imagine if that trend caught on. And throughout the whole region, defence forces were not about projecting force and threatening your neighbours, but it caught on, and we had defence forces purely about defence. Imagine how much more stable the world would be. Imagine how much money we'd have to spend on schools and hospitals. And that's the future we should be pushing for. Not in real time.
David, you were speaking there about this idea that the United States provides a security umbrella for Australia, and that's why we need them. And Australia is not the only country to have historically relied on that guarantee, I suppose, from the United States. You know, that we would accept some hypocrisy, we would expect a level of flouting of the international rules in return for benefits, you know, from the United States. And that is, I guess, leads me to the next question that I've got here, around what is happening now in the Gulf. Because many Gulf states have also relied on US protection, they're also reliant on US defence material, much in the way Australia is. And the United States at the moment has failed to protect those Gulf states. So I wanted to ask you, David, and perhaps you, Jamie, if you want to weigh in as well, what the implications of this are for the region as well, but for Australia too.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty extraordinary, you know, pretty much all the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others have all taken an approach over the last couple of decades, and it's sort of accelerated a bit since the first and second Iraq wars, that if they have US bases in their country, US naval bases, air bases, sort of early deployment bases for US Marines and attack, that those US bases will make them safe, because the US will ensure they're safe, and the fact that there are US bases there means no one will want to threaten them. The existence of US bases will protect them. Well, actually, it turns out that US bases are making them incredibly unsafe right now, because that's what the Iran is largely targeting. US bases, US embassies, US infrastructure throughout the region is what is actually dragging them into a war. And in fact, the presence of a massive US military in the region, a huge US deployment in the region, far from making them safe, having the US military under the control of Donald Trump, ready in tooth and claw, is actually dragged the entire region into a cataclysmic war, which is destroying their economic base. Like, I mean, Dubai, I don't know if you used to see those sales pitches for Dubai. You know, come to Dubai, have 3 lovely days on break your trip to Europe. Come to Dubai, retire in Dubai. It's safe and lovely and stable, and the water's warm. Come to Dubai, invest in Dubai real estate. It's the most secure place. Put your money in Dubai. Would anybody do that now? Would anybody be thinking about doing that now? So actually, it's kind of a exhibit A to disprove the idea that US bases and enmeshment with the US military keeps you safe. What's being proven in real time in the Gulf is actually US military bases, enmeshment with the US military, inviting the US military into your region, and they're no more neighbours of the Middle East than they are neighbours of West Asia. Inviting them into your region is a recipe for bloody disaster, and we should be learning that lesson in real time.
This is a follow-up, David, again from an anonymous questioner, and I think it is one that many of us struggle with. You know, we struggle with the moral questions around Australia's role in the world. And And the question is that shouldn't Australia assist in combating autocratic regimes?
Well, I mean, yes, we should combat, if you like, in inverted commas, autocratic regimes by our ideals, by showing an example to the world about what a functioning democracy that funds its schools and its hospitals and gives people an equal say, about a democracy that taxes billionaires, maybe taxes them out of existence, and makes for a fair society. Like, that is a great way of combating autocratic, despotic regimes that can't do that, can't deliver that kind of freedom and positive life, and a sort of a personal security rather than a kind of militaristic security. A personal security where you feel safe in your home. You feel if you get sick, the hospital will be there and you'll be protected and medicine won't bankrupt your family. The idea that we're protecting the planet and your kids are going to have a safe future and your grandkids are going to have a safe future. That kind of security in a free society is, I think, a terrific thing to combat despotic regimes with. And we should do a hell of a lot more of that. But the idea that we make the world safer by joining with hegemonic powers to go to war against people they identify as bad, which kind of was put to me by the ABC a number of times this week, you know, why aren't the Greens supporting this war? The regime in Iran is bad. And I said, if that's how the world works, we are ending the world rapidly, if that's the way the world works. So I think we combat these regimes by being the example. But we should also be clear, you know, really despotic regimes, we should put trade sanctions on. We should ensure that we don't sell them weapons. We should not be involved in wicked wars, genocidal wars. We should not be siding with Israel and funding a genocidal war in Gaza. We should actually I suppose one of the real things that's sticking in my throat of all of the horror that we're seeing, you know, the death, the destruction, the black rain and all of this, none of that is visible, it seems, to Penny Wong or Albanese. If you're being targeted by US or Israeli bombs and missiles, then you're not a human and you don't exist then. Mm-hmm. But if you're being targeted by Iranian missiles and bombs, well then absolutely we're going to rush to your rescue and do whatever we can. Like, there's been silence about the tens of thousands of Australians living in Lebanon, and now more than 1 million people in Lebanon who have been made homeless, living in fear. Silence about that, but we are rushing to send military forces apparently to defend the United Arab Emirates as though it's some great friend of ours. And you know, the United Arab Emirates is not a democracy. Women have bugger all rights in there. There's no democratic rights, and they're currently engaged in 2 criminal wars in Yemen and in Sudan in gross breach of pretty much every human rights provision you can imagine, and we're a major weapons supplier to the UAE. When are we hearing that? Or that kind of narrative. So, yes, I think we should combat. We should not sell weapons to the United Arab Emirates. We should not sell weapons to Israel, and we should not be part of the US military.
I think, David, you know, what you're getting at there is that it's not radical to ask for consistency. You know, that this Australian government talks about the international rules-based order all the time and is hiding behind the smaller details of that international rules-based order to say that, well, actually Australia is not at war in Iran, we're engaged in collective defence, which under international law is something different, while refusing to reinforce the foundational principles of international law and affirm that this war is illegal. Why do you think the Australian government is so reluctant to call out those inconsistencies in international law and the most abhorrent actions by the United States in particular? Because we know, I mean, there is unrest within the Labor Party about this. So why is the government so reluctant?
Well, they don't feel they have permission to call out. If Donald Trump tells them that they can criticise Donald Trump, then they will. But until he does, they're not going to, because they're in fear. They're genuinely in fear of taking any steps to do that. But I think it is extraordinary, the hypocrisy. And just one piece of gross hypocrisy at the very centre of this whole debate that you're not allowed to talk about. If you mention it in Canberra or Parliament, it's like you farted in a lift, right? You're not allowed to talk about this. So apparently, if you hear Senator Wong or Prime Minister or Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, who just has a little funny aside, you know you're not allowed to call him Minister. None of his staff are allowed to call him Minister. They get reprimanded if they call him Minister. They have to call him Deputy Prime Minister. Otherwise, these are the people we're dealing with, right? These are the people we're dealing with. No, I'm not kidding. That is actually a thing. So we're apparently supporting this war and supporting the US attacks and supporting the Israeli attacks because we are concerned that Iran may get an illegal, unsanctioned nuclear weapons in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that's why we're supporting Israeli strikes on Iran. That's why we're supporting US strikes on Iran. Now, putting to one side, the International Atomic Energy Agency says that is untrue. There is no imminent risk of Iran getting a nuclear weapon. And putting to one side that I thought Donald Trump obliterated them in June of last year, and he told us that again barely 3 weeks ago. Putting to one side the fantasy of that argument and the confected nature of that argument, we are supporting Israel blowing the crap out of Iran, killing Iranian civilians, attacking them because we don't want Iran to get an illegal, unsanctioned nuclear arsenal. Now, I know I'm not allowed to say this, but Israel has about 200 nuclear weapons on a hair trigger, totally illegal, totally outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, a totally destabilising element in the Middle East, and nobody says it. And nobody says it. Because Washington would come down on Australia like a ton of bricks if it dare pointed out that there's this great big nuclear weapon elephant in the corner of the room and nobody mentioned it. It's extraordinary.
Jamie, what do you think it would mean to Americans who are, in their own way, in great numbers, resisting Donald Trump and Trumpism? What do you think it would mean to Americans for the Australian government and Australians to call out the worst excesses of the Trump administration?
Well, yeah, I'm originally from, as you may have guessed, from the United States, and calling back home to friends and family there, many of whom I think are, of course, are suffering. The situation in the United States and cities, with the attacks of ICE on communities, or urban communities and immigrant communities, people of color disproportionately, and American cities are under attack from this administration. The level of military presence on the streets of many American cities is terrifying. And the destruction and the threats to the basic hopes that many have for a more democratic United States are extremely under threat today. So there's a great deal of fear, of frustration, and of concern, but there's also hope. And I think we here can take hope from the kind of movements we've seen in the U.S. in recent years, from Black Lives Matter to the resistance to ICE, to the whistles and the efforts from many community groups, people such as yourselves and groups such as ours, who are on the streets in American cities looking to protect their neighbors, looking to stand together, looking to offer a different vision of what the United States can be, has been, and could be going forward. And I think those kind of folks would take heart from this kind of experience. We take heart from the kind of resistance that we can offer. There's a long history and a proud history that I'm glad to be a part of resistance in the United States, to standing up to its military presence overseas, to resisting the U.S. imperial military forces around the world, and then calling for a different kind of vision for the United States at home and abroad. And I think those are our friends and allies. Those are the people that we can stand with. And I think there's a lot of opportunity and support for that. So our voices here, although they may not be welcome inside some very small corridors of Washington's across the streets, in cities and in small towns around America, are indeed very much welcome. And I think we should feel strong that Donald Trump does not represent all of the United States. In much of the country, of course, most of them did not vote for Donald Trump, and certainly are making efforts to make it possible for a different kind of United States today. There are voices, and I think sparks of hope, whether it's New Mayor in New York City, whether it's sort of resistance movements around American cities that I think we can look to for hope. So I think there are kinds of allies for us, partners that we can reach out to. And I think the kind of movement and resistance that we can have here to something like AUKUS has friends and has supporters in the U.S.
Jamie, I think that's such an important point, because we're often told that our relationship with the United States is based on shared values. In fact, our friend Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles has gone on the national broadcaster and said that, and this was recent, Australia's relationship with the United States is based on the shared values of democracy and the rule of law. Which is not untrue, and I think that's what you were getting at, Jamie, is that actually we do have a long history and a deep history of democratic exchange with the United States, where we have learnt from the best of each other. And I think it's really important to remind ourselves of that, because so much of the media and political coverage of the relationship, and I'm sure David gets this all the time, dismisses our deep concerns about what is happening in the United States as us wanting to abandon America. Well, that means you want to abandon the United States. And in all the polling that we do that says Australians are deeply concerned about Donald Trump, they have less faith in the alliance, there's this quick little caveat that they'll put in and say, oh, but people, they don't actually want to abandon the United States like those radicals. And I think it's really important to remind ourselves that none of us are arguing for abandoning the United States. We're actually deeply concerned about what is happening to our friends and our family and our colleagues in the United States, and our relationship, the way that it's set up at the moment, is undermining those connections and those concerns, because it's prioritising relationships with Trump, it's prioritising a military relationship that is deeply anti-democratic. And that's what brings me now to the next top question, and I'll start with you, David, is to ask really how it got to this point, to ask how our relationship is so actively against democratic scrutiny and against transparency that it gets to the point where a decision about the most radical change to Australian defence policy, about the biggest international transfer of Australian sovereign wealth in our history, can be made by quite literally like a couple of blokes in a room, and we hear nothing about it until 11 o'clock the night before the announcement of the AUKUS submarine deal. How did it get to this point?
Well, it got to the point partly because the so-called parties of government, I think it's framing this concept, but Labor and the Liberal Party in particular, but with the sort of gnats as a little poodle they bring along occasionally, but it's really Labor and the Liberal Party, have decided that they have some secret knowledge that none of you have. And no one in the crossbench has, nobody else sent to Parliament has, Jamie doesn't have it, Emma doesn't have it. They have a secret knowledge. And they have all this secret special knowledge that they get in secret special briefings with ASIO in the US, and their friends in the Five Eyes. They have secret knowledge that they get with their secret briefings with the defence officials. They have secret knowledge they get in their secret briefings with Home Affairs. And with this secret knowledge, only they know what is good for the country. And they're not going to let you have a say in it, because you would have dangerously different ideas. And it is actually their thinking. And they have persuaded themselves that this small group of people with all this secret knowledge are the only ones who should be treated with any power and granted any power to determine our defence policy or our foreign policy. And they've partly persuaded themselves, but obviously it's also incredibly convenient that they can monopolise the power, monopolise the connections, monopolise, in their eyes, their post-political careers and connections with defence manufacturers and the like. But they have persuaded themselves of this. And obviously they've been assisted in that by a bunch of well-funded far-right think tanks, which are largely funded by US weapons manufacturers and billionaires and the US State Department. And between them, they have created this kind of decision-making, where literally the decision about AUKUS, there wasn't even a brief to Cabinet. There wasn't an assessment by the Defence Department. There wasn't a pros and cons. There wasn't a costed policy. It was literally a handful of largely men inside the Morrison government, remember him? He was great thinker, who had worked with Washington to try and undercut a deal with a French weapons manufacturer, because the US don't like French weapons manufacturers because they don't get a cut out of it, and they don't have the same control out of it. So this desperate effort from people inside the Pentagon and people inside Russell, which is the defence establishment in Canberra, desperately trying to undermine that deal with the French. And to undermine it, they came up with this genius idea of AUKUS and getting us US and UK nuclear submarines to replace the non-nuclear ones we're getting from the French, which we asked them to retrofit from nuclear ones so as we could deliver it. Like, that is actually what happened. And they made that decision, probably 5 people at most, 5 people in the Morrison government. No briefing, no external analysis, no consideration of pros and cons from defence. Having made that decision, they then brought in Richard Marles, Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese for a 2 or 3 hour no-docs briefing. No-docs, because there weren't any. That's why there were no docs. A no-docs briefing. And after a 2 or 3 hour verbal briefing from Scott Morrison, Labor was persuaded, and then literally Albanese then walked into the caucus and didn't even put it to a vote of the Labor caucus and says, we have made a decision, we're going to agree to AUKUS as well. That's how we got in this mess. No docs, no briefing, no time, no democracy. And the reason you weren't asked is because they don't think you should be asked. Because they think your ideas are dangerous and they think they have a monopoly of secret knowledge. And that is actually so undemocratic and so scary and so often, so rarely talked about.
Jamie, one of the ways that AUKUS was framed initially in that first announcement, the Labor Party don't use this phrasing anymore for obvious reasons, but the Morrison government at the time and the Johnson government in the UK framed AUKUS as the revival of the Anglosphere. And a lot of this acceptance and secrecy that David is talking about trades on and reinforces fear, and deeply racist fear that exists in Australia, particularly around China, although it's not always China that's the focus of that racism. When I was growing up, it was Indonesia. Different countries play different roles. But I've got a question here that asks about how that notes that this racist fear is still very much alive, and it's probably not a fair question, Jamie. But the question asks, how do we begin to combat this fear in Australia?
Well, so I teach in a university here, at the University of Sydney, and we suffered the targets of the China fear most directly. We were on the forefront of a lot of this. The supposed impression and influence from Chinese spies and China's influence in our university. And I can say the culture of fear and the influence, and I want to say a word about foreign influence in our country, to follow what David said, the far greater influence within our university, and really using our university as a force of influence more broadly, is the United States. The U.S. Study Center, funded largely from American military defense manufacturers and the U.S. government, with close ties the U.S. defense establishment, is a force using our public dollars and the legitimacy of our public universities to project American interest and American influence outward into the city and into our country more broadly. So the real concerns and those fears are being fed by people who have a dog in the fight, who have an interest in this. And I think they've been fostering the kind of false fears and encouraging attitudes, racist attitudes towards many of our fellow citizens for a political agenda. So I think we start by calling that out. I think we start by recognizing where are the agent provocateurs truly amongst us? What are the institutions of influence that really are shaping our politics in undemocratic fashion? And I think that's the way we begin to call this out. I also think that I was in some way heartened in the last election, the ways in which Chinese Australians really came together to call out the challenges around racism, during COVID crisis, the fact that many people felt targeted by this, the blaming of Chinese Australians, I think is something that enabled us ultimately to start having a more honest conversation about a lot of this climate of fear and the fear-mongering that happens amongst us. So I think recognizing that, particularly when it's in our public institutions, is the first step, the calling this out, and then to begin to be honest about where are the real sources of fears in this country and who is truly influencing our politics.
I guess a follow-up for you, David, is, and I get this question all the time as well, that we have this idea that we need a great protector. If you're advocating for changing the alliance or that the United States isn't our great protector, what's the alternative?
Yeah, this is that sort of deep dependency that they have given themselves inside defence, inside the Department of Foreign Affairs. And I find it extraordinary, right? They will attack me and they'll attack the Greens and the part of the country we believe in, and they'll say, you don't believe in Australia, you don't believe that, in Australian values, and you want to sell Australia's interests out. That's why, and then in the next breath, they'll say, we absolutely have to be dependent upon the United States, and we absolutely have to buy only their equipment, and we have to absolutely go to war when the United States tells us, and we absolutely can't question the alliance. And how dare you talk about this idea? As though that's our pathway to an independent, it's this bizarre doublespeak that they have. But implicit in their argument is, well, if you don't have the United States as your great and powerful friend, then you have to pick another one. You have to pick another one. That's compulsory, apparently. You have to have one. I'm not sure where that rule comes from, that you have to have one. A great and powerful friend who tells you what to do and treats you like a vassal. I don't know where that rule came from. I think it is a manufactured bullshit rule that suits Washington and a bunch of elites in here who have a relationship with Washington. That's where that rule comes from. Sometimes you see these rules. I remember at one point, it was early in the first half of last year, the coalition dared ask a question that seemed to question whether or not the Australian government was really committed to the US alliance. And I remember Penny Wong standing up and saying in the Senate, I can't believe you asked that question. How dare you ask that question? And it was about whether or not an environmental change would be impacted by our relationship with Washington. Major environmental reforms were going through. There was some question about whether or not we were not showing sufficient loyalty to the United States because we were thinking about having some independent assessment of environmental matters, and that may make it hard for the United States to access rare earths in Australia. It was a really weird debate, right? But there was a major environmental reform going in, and the United States raised the US alliance as a reason why Labor were doing bad things with the environment. And Labor gets up and says, well, look, how dare you do that? Don't you know, this is Penny Wong, don't you know that there's a rule that you do not bring the US alliance into discussions about mere domestic policy. And I'm thinking to myself, where's the rule? Where is this rule from? And there are all these rules, apparently. All these rules. And I don't know where you get them from. There's a rule we need a great and powerful friend. There's a rule we can't criticise the United States. There's a rule that you're not allowed to think about foreign policy. There are all these rules, right? But see, Vietnam doesn't feel like it needs this rule. Like Vietnam is quite happy having a distant relationship with the United States, quite a distant relationship. They don't much like them. They think they're kind of bad for the region, right? And they have an independent relationship with China. They don't feel a need for a great and powerful friend. They're not, rushing off to form an alliance with Donald Trump. Malaysia, Indonesia, they don't feel like they need a great and powerful friend to live in the region. They seem to be able to work out what's in their national interest and discuss that and have a mature relationship with China and have a mature relationship with the United States and work out what's in their national interest. This idea that it's a binary choice, that if we end our absolutely dependent relationship with the United States, we have to find someone else to have a codependency relationship with in the planet, is plainly wrong. And they use that as a binary to delegitimise questioning of our dependency on the US, and we should absolutely reject it.
I think that leads me, we're rapidly running out of time, so that leads me to probably my last question. Jamie, it's in the face of all of that, in the face of that overwhelming force, in the face of what's happening in the world at the moment, it's very hard not to feel defeated and as if Australia's role in all this is inevitable. So I wanted to ask you, and I'll ask the same to David, what do you think are the possibilities for Australia's role in the world going forward?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to recognize that it starts right here. I think, as David said, we started by planning this event locally, thinking, what can we do to cooperate? Many people pounding the pavement, dropping those leaflets in your letterboxes or handing the leaflet to you at a train station, sharing this information. That it begins by democracy right here at home, and right here in our neighbours and our communities. I think the strength of Australia is in this room. As a refugee myself in the United States, and someone who's very glad to have become an Australian citizen, I find the strength in our connections, in our community, in our neighbors, in our institutions. I know when we were facing the China fear and the China panic a few years ago in our institution, I felt very strongly. We did publications and wrote about this, and we can take care of ourselves. We have good public institutions. We have strong institutions. We have good rules. We have transparent laws, and we're not afraid. We're not afraid. I'm not afraid of China, and I'm not afraid of defending and leaning on ourselves. So I think the strength of Australia begins here and goes outward. It goes outward to our region, goes out in our country, and more broadly in the region where we live. And I think we should feel confident. I feel optimistic. I feel we're at a tremendous moment of opportunity. The Trumpian presidencies, amongst their many terrible tragedies, have given us an opening and give us an opportunity. And hopefully we're growing stronger. The fact that all of you came out tonight, Pennant Hills on a Saturday night, we're holding you from your dinner, and you're spending your time with us shows that you care, and everybody around you cares. So I think the strength goes from right here in this room and goes outward. And to me, that gives me great hope and great optimism.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel incredibly glad that Jamie's doing that inside the Sydney University, part of our local Greens and all of the work from local Greens and all of you coming. I absolutely endorse what Jamie said. I feel incredibly hopeful when I hear Emma talk about, analyse this from an historical, an academic, but also a sort of realistic analysis. I feel absolutely empowered when I come to events like this. And as horrific, I mean, we've seen so many horrific things in the last 2.5 years. The appalling genocide in Gaza and the images we've seen and the thought of the kids and the mums and the dads and 2.5 million people living in tents and the destruction. Like, that is horrific on a scale that I think still, when I wake up in the morning and I think about it, it just sends me into a kind of deep, kind of depressed cycle. But you can't let that be the response to it. You can't let your response be a sort of fatalistic acceptance. If we're offended by that and appalled by that, well, then we need to organise to make sure that's not how the world works. And organise so Australia is not a part of that. And I think the same as I've been watching this horror show unfold in the Middle East. The missile strike that destroyed a girls' school in the first 4 hours, and then all of the political doublespeak and attempt to pretend it wasn't a US missile and all of that, the usual play that we see of lies coming from the US and our own government about that. And then the black rain falling into Tehran and poisoning the water and poisoning the land, and the wave of fear going through Lebanon and the hundreds killed in Beirut. It would be... There are different times when you think it's so black and it's so bleak and you just want to, put your head under the cover. Maybe think we're on a US submarine, I don't know. But you just feel so bleak about it, right? And you think, well, what do you do? And but it's at moments like this that we have probably the greatest power to change the world. Because for decades, the US has been doing this for decades, engaged in horrific wars of choice, destroying other countries, tearing down their governments, exploiting them and their resources for their own. It's been happening for decades. But now the mask has been ripped off like never before, and now we can see it. And as Emma said, Donald Trump is not some kind of crazy aberration. He's part of a long-term trend in the US politics that we're now seeing. And I agree with Jamie, there are amazing people inside the United States fighting this and wanting a different future. Well, I'm with them. I'm not with Donald Trump. I'm not with the US military. I'm with those people fighting on the streets of Minnesota. And I'm with the people in Beirut who are desperately trying to find somewhere safe. And I'm with ordinary people on the street in Tehran who are desperately running, trying to find a home and trying to, wondering if their kids are safe. And I'm with ordinary people growing up in Shanghai who are thinking about where they want to send their kids to school or what their future will be or what they're going to have for dinner. There's moments like this where you can choose whose side you're on. You can be on the side of a handful of powerful, nasty men who want to control the world and destroy it for their own gain. Or you can be on the side of the mum taking their kids to school in Shanghai and the uncle and the aunt wondering if their nieces are safe in Shiraz. And it's a moments like this where you get to choose, right? And it's at moments like this where choices suddenly become available, where political opportunity becomes available. And this is a moment we need to get organised. And we need to get organised around the country and have more meetings like this and change our politics. Because the mask has been ripped off. The Australian public can see what's happening. And as horrific as it is, there's never been a better time to tear down AUKUS, to actually detach ourselves from the United States, to think about a hopeful, independent, principled Australia that plays a positive part in the world. There's actually, as awful as it is, as much as sometimes you just want to pull the doona over your head, there has never been a better time for our struggle and our fight. And seeing you here tonight, being between Jamie and Emma, seeing the work of our local groups, as strange as it seems, I've never been more hopeful that we can go down that path.